I was about to marry a woman I barely loved, until a child's whisper made me question everything I thought I controlled. The chandelier above me shimmered like frozen light, each crystal catching the glow of 1,000 carefully placed candles, reflecting a life I had built piece by piece over 65 years, a life measured in power, in silence, in decisions no one else dared to make, and yet as I stood there in a tailored black suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, waiting for the music to cue, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Not fear, not doubt, but something quieter, something colder, like the echo of a question I didn't know how to answer. The estate stretched for acres beyond the glass walls, manicured lawns rolling into darkness, security posted at every gate, every corner, every unseen angle, because that's what my world required: control, precision, certainty, and tonight was supposed to be the final proof that I still had all three. Lillian Hart stood at the far end of the aisle, flawless in white, her smile practiced, her posture perfect, every movement calculated to appear effortless, and to anyone watching, she was everything a man like me should want: elegant, composed, untouchable, the kind of woman who completed the picture people expected when they looked at someone like Victor Kane. The guests murmured softly, glasses clinking, whispers weaving through the air like a quiet current: politicians, investors, men who owed me favors and men who feared they might one day have to, all gathered to witness something they would later describe as inevitable. I adjusted my cufflinks, the cool metal grounding me, reminding me that this wasn't about love, it never was, it was about legacy, about closing a chapter cleanly, about choosing stability over ghosts that refused to stay buried. The officiant cleared his throat, the signal that everything was about to begin, and for a brief second, the world narrowed to the space between me and the woman waiting for me to say yes. Then I felt it, not a sound, not at first, just a shift, a presence too small to matter and yet impossible to ignore, like a ripple in still water, and when I looked down, I saw her. She couldn't have been more than 8, maybe 9, standing just off the aisle where she didn't belong, her small hand clutching the edge of a chair, her eyes fixed on me with a kind of intensity that didn't match her age, didn't match anything in this carefully controlled room. No one else noticed her, or if they did, they dismissed her, a child out of place, a minor interruption in a perfectly orchestrated night, but I couldn't look away. She stepped closer, hesitant but determined, her shoes making no sound against the polished floor, and before I could signal security, before I could restore order, she reached for my hand. Her fingers were warm, steady, and when she leaned in, her voice barely louder than a breath, she said, "Stop, she's scamming you." The words didn't echo, they didn't shatter the room, but inside me, something shifted, something old and buried cracking just enough to let doubt seep through, and for the first time in years, I wasn't the man in control of the moment, I was the man who had to decide whether to listen to a stranger who looked at me like she already knew the answer. Her words did not sound like fear, they sounded like certainty, and that was what unsettled me the most because in my world certainty was earned through years of experience, not whispered by a child who should not have been there in the first place, yet her grip did not tremble and her eyes did not look away as if she had already made peace with whatever came next, and I realized that everyone was still watching me, waiting for me to move, to speak, to restore the order that had just been quietly broken. I slowly straightened, my hand still in hers for half a second longer than it should have been, and when I released it, I did not look at Lillian, I looked at the men standing along the perimeter, the ones who understood signals without words, and with the smallest shift of my gaze, the music stopped. It was subtle, almost polite, the kind of silence that made people wonder if it was intentional or a mistake, and that was when the murmuring began, low at first, then spreading like a ripple across the room as heads turned in conversations. Paused mid-sentence. Lillian's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, so small that most would have missed it, but I did not build my life by missing details, and in that flicker I saw something I had not seen before, not elegance, not composure, but calculation adjusting to a change in variables. "Victor," she said softly, her voice warm, reassuring, exactly what the room expected from a woman in her position, "is everything all right?" I did not answer her immediately because I was still looking at the girl, still trying to understand why her presence felt less like an interruption and more like a message I had been meant to receive, and when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, controlled, the same voice that had closed deals and ended conflicts without ever needing to be raised. "What is your name?" I asked, not to the room, not to Lillian, but to her. The guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent, because this was not how nights like this were supposed to unfold. The girl hesitated for the first time, just a breath, then she said, "Emily." No last name, no explanation, just a name that settled into the space between us like something unfinished. I nodded once, then turned slightly, enough for the man closest to me to step forward without drawing attention, and in a tone that did not carry beyond a few feet, I said, "Check everything." He did not ask what I meant because he already knew, and within seconds, the quiet machinery behind the scene began to move, phones pulled discreetly from pockets, messages sent, information requested, all invisible to the guests who were now pretending not to stare. Lillian took a step closer, her heels clicking softly against the marble, her expression composed again, but her eyes sharper now, searching my face for something she could use, something she could turn. "You are letting a child disrupt our wedding?" she asked gently, as if framing the situation for me, as if reminding me who I was supposed to be in this moment. I met her gaze then, fully, and for the first time that night, I allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to make it uncomfortable. "I do not ignore warnings," I said, my voice even, no matter where they come from. The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been, and I saw it again, that brief flicker behind her eyes, the recalculation, the shift, and in that instant I knew something had changed, not just for her, but for me, because the certainty I had walked in with was gone, replaced by a question I could not yet answer, and as I looked back down at Emily, standing small but unshaken in a room full of people who measured power in influence and money, I realized she was the only one who had spoken the truth without asking for anything in return, and that made her the most dangerous voice in the room. The room did not collapse into chaos, it tightened instead, like a held breath no one wanted to release, and I could feel the shift in attention, subtle but absolute, every eye no longer on the ceremony but on me, waiting to see whether I would dismiss the interruption or follow it, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed the silence to work in my favor because silence had always been my most effective tool. Emily did not move, did not look around for approval or reassurance, she simply stood there as if she had already done what she came to do, and that confidence in someone so small made something in my chest feel unfamiliar, not discomfort, not irritation, but recognition, like I had seen that kind of certainty before in someone who had learned too early that hesitation came with consequences. Behind me, I could hear the faint vibration of a phone, then another, the quiet signals that information was being pulled apart in real time, and I knew it would not take long, it never did, because the systems I had built were designed for moments exactly like this, moments when truth needed to surface without announcement. Lillian's voice came again, softer now, edged with something she could not quite hide. "Victor, this is unnecessary," she said, stepping closer until she was within arm's reach, her perfume light but deliberate, her presence carefully measured. "You are letting a misunderstanding grow into something embarrassing." Embarrassing. The word lingered, as if that was the worst outcome she could imagine, and that alone told me more than she intended. I turned slightly toward her, just enough to meet her eyes again, and in that brief exchange I stopped seeing the woman I had agreed to marry and started seeing the gaps, the rehearsed pauses, the way her smile arrived a fraction of a second too late when something did not go according to plan. "Embarrassment is temporary," I said evenly, "mistakes are not." The murmurs in the room shifted again, quieter now, more cautious, because they understood that this was no longer a social inconvenience, this was something else, something that belonged to my world, not theirs. Emily tugged lightly at the edge of my sleeve, not impatient, just present, and when I looked down, she leaned in again, her voice even lower this time. "She is lying about who she is," she said, each word careful, deliberate, as if she had repeated it to herself before saying it out loud, "and she knows you will not check." That stopped me more than anything else she had said because it was not just an accusation, it was an assumption about me, about how I operated, about the blind spot I had allowed to exist tonight, and I realized she was not just warning me about Lillian, she was exposing something about myself I had chosen not to examine. A man approached from my left, one of mine, his posture unchanged, his expression neutral to anyone watching, but I saw the confirmation in his eyes before he even spoke, and when he leaned close, his voice did not rise above a whisper. "There are inconsistencies," he said, "records do not align, history is incomplete." Incomplete. Another word that carried more weight than it seemed to, and I felt the last piece of certainty I had been holding onto slip quietly out of place. Lillian's composure cracked again, just for a second, but this time it did not recover as smoothly, her gaze flicking toward the exits, toward the people, calculating distance, timing, options, and that was when the room changed completely, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way only a few of us could feel, the moment when control shifted from one person to another without a single raised voice. I exhaled slowly, the decision settling into me with the kind of clarity that does not require explanation, and when I looked back at Emily, she did not smile, did not celebrate, she simply watched, waiting to see if I would do what she already believed I should have done from the beginning, and in that moment I understood something I had not expected to learn tonight, that power was not about never being wrong, it was about recognizing the moment you were and choosing what to do next. I did not raise my voice, I did not make a scene, because power never needed volume to be understood, it only needed clarity, and when I finally stepped forward, closing the distance between myself and Lillian, the room seemed to follow the movement without realizing it, every conversation fading into a silence that no one dared to break, every expectation quietly shifting into something else entirely. She held her ground, to her credit, her chin lifted just enough to suggest confidence, but I could see it now, the tension beneath the surface, the way her breathing had changed, the way her eyes searched mine not for connection but for leverage, for something she could still control. "Victor," she said again, softer this time, almost personal, as if reminding me of the version of myself she thought she understood, "you are making a mistake." I studied her for a moment longer than necessary, not because I needed time to decide, but because I wanted to see if there was anything real left in her expression, anything unscripted, anything that had not been carefully placed there for effect, and when I found nothing, I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not disappointment, just a quiet finality. "No," I said, my voice steady, "the mistake would be ignoring what is already in front of me." The words were simple, but they carried enough weight that even those who did not understand the details understood the outcome, and I saw it ripple outward, the realization spreading through the room like a slow wave, this was no longer a wedding, this was a correction. One of my men stepped closer, not aggressively, not urgently, just present, a reminder that things were already moving beyond this moment, that whatever came next would not be decided here in front of an audience that had never truly been part of this world. Lillian's composure fractured then, not dramatically, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough for me to see the truth behind it, the calculation giving way to something sharper, something more desperate, and for a brief second, I wondered how long she had believed she could manage this, how long she had assumed I would not look closely enough to notice. "You are listening to a child," she said, and this time there was an edge she could not hide, a thin line of frustration cutting through her carefully measured tone. I glanced down at Emily again, still standing beside me, still silent now, watching everything unfold with a calm that did not belong to someone her age, and I realized that she was not waiting for validation, she was waiting for a decision. "I am listening to the only person here who has nothing to gain from lying," I replied, and that was when the last illusion broke, not just for me, but for everyone watching, because the room understood that whatever had been planned for tonight was no longer happening. A phone vibrated again at my side, and this time I did not need to hear the words, I saw the confirmation in the brief nod I received, the kind of nod that closed conversations without needing to explain them, and I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment shift into something irreversible. "This is over," I said, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly enough that it reached every corner of the room, and with those 3 words, the entire night changed direction. Lillian took a step back, just one, but it was enough to show that she understood what had just been taken from her, not the ceremony, not the audience, but the control she had been holding onto since the moment she walked into my life. I did not follow her, did not escalate, because this was not about confrontation, it was about recognition, about seeing something for what it truly was and choosing not to pretend otherwise. And as the silence settled again, heavier now, more honest, I felt Emily's presence beside me like a quiet anchor, and for the first time that night, I understood that she had not just interrupted something, she had revealed it, and there was no going back to who I had been 5 minutes ago. No one applauded, no one moved to fill the silence, because there are moments when even the most powerful people in a room understand that they are witnessing something they should not interrupt, and this was one of those moments, the kind that quietly redraws the lines no one admits are there. Lillian stood still for a second too long, her composure no longer effortless but held together by intention, the kind that requires constant adjustment, and I watched as she recalculated again, searching for a way to recover what had already slipped beyond her reach. "You are overreacting," she said finally, her voice lower now, more controlled, as if she believed she could still guide the narrative back to something manageable. "There are explanations for everything you think you see." I did not respond right away, not because I was uncertain, but because I had learned long ago that people reveal more when they are given space to speak, especially when they are trying to convince themselves as much as anyone else. Around us, the guests had begun to shift, subtle movements, exchanged glances, quiet steps backward, creating distance without drawing attention, because instinct told them that the evening had crossed into territory where they did not belong. "Explanations require truth," I said at last, my voice calm, measured, "and what I am seeing does not leave much room for that." Her jaw tightened, just slightly, and for the first time, she looked past me, toward the edges of the room, toward the exits, toward the invisible structure that had once been working in her favor and was now closing in around her without a single visible command. Emily remained beside me, silent again, her small presence steady, as if she had already accepted whatever outcome followed, and I realized that she was not here to watch, she was here to make sure something happened, something that had been delayed for far too long. "You think you know everything," Lillian said, and now there was something sharper beneath her words, not anger exactly, but frustration slipping through the cracks. "But you do not know where I came from, what I had to do to survive." The statement hung there, heavy, almost persuasive, the kind of line designed to shift sympathy, to introduce doubt, but I had heard variations of it before, in different rooms, from different people, and it had never changed the truth of what they had chosen to become. "We all come from somewhere," I replied evenly, "but that does not excuse what we do once we have a choice." Another quiet vibration at my side, another confirmation I did not need to hear aloud, and I knew the situation had moved beyond speculation, beyond possibility, into certainty. I took a slow breath, not because I needed to steady myself, but because I understood that what I said next would not just end a conversation, it would redefine the night entirely. "This arrangement ends here," I said, not loudly, not forcefully, just clearly enough that there was no room for misinterpretation, and with those words, the last thread connecting this moment to what it was supposed to be finally broke. Lillian's expression changed then, not dramatically, but enough for me to see the realization settle in, the understanding that there was no longer anything left to negotiate, no angle left to play, and for a brief second, something almost human flickered across her face, something that might have been regret or simply the recognition of a plan that had failed. She did not argue again, did not raise her voice, she simply stepped back, creating space where there had once been intention, and that was when the room exhaled, quietly, collectively, as if everyone had been holding their breath without realizing it. I looked down at Emily once more, her eyes still on me, still searching, not for approval, but for something deeper, something I had not yet fully understood, and as the weight of the night settled into something irreversible, I realized that ending a mistake was only the beginning, because now I needed to understand why she had come to me at all, and what part of my past had finally decided to return. The music did not return, not immediately. Because no one knew if it should, and that hesitation stretched across the room like a quiet acknowledgement that something irreversible had just taken place, something no string quartet could soften or disguise. I loosened my tie slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of habit, the kind of movement that marked the end of one role and the beginning of another, and as I did, the weight of expectation shifted away from ceremony and settled into something far more familiar: control, consequences, clarity. "Clear the floor," I said quietly, not to the room, but to the people who understood that tone, and within seconds the space began to change, not abruptly, not visibly enough to alarm anyone, but efficiently, guests guided toward the terrace, conversations redirected, the illusion of normalcy preserved just enough to avoid panic. Lillian was no longer the center of attention, and that, more than anything, told me how completely the situation had turned, because in a room like this, relevance was everything, and she had just lost it. She did not resist when one of my men stepped beside her, not forceful, not threatening, just present, a silent indication that her choices were now limited to how she handled the exit, and I watched her closely, not out of suspicion anymore, but out of curiosity, wondering if there was anything left unsaid that might still matter. "This is not how this ends," she said under her breath as she passed me, the confidence in her voice thinner now, stretched. "You will regret trusting the wrong person." I did not respond, because regret was a luxury I had learned to calculate, not fear, and right now, the only unknown in the room was not her, it was the small hand that had just rewritten the course of the night. When Lillian disappeared beyond the doors, the tension did not vanish with her, it lingered, quieter but heavier, settling into the kind of silence that follows truth rather than performance, and I turned my full attention to Emily. She looked smaller now that the room had widened around her, the space no longer crowded with expectation, just distance and light and the faint hum of voices from outside, but her expression had not changed, still steady, still certain, as if she had expected everything that had just happened. "Walk with me," I said, and she did not hesitate, her fingers brushing against mine again as we moved away from the center of the room, away from the eyes that were still trying not to follow us. We stopped near the glass wall overlooking the grounds, the night stretching out beyond it in quiet contrast to what had just unfolded inside, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence no longer tense, just waiting. "How did you know?" I asked finally, not sharply, not accusingly, just directly, because whatever answer she gave would matter more than anything I had heard so far. She looked out at the dark lawn instead of at me, her reflection faint against the glass, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than before, but no less certain. "Because she did it before," she said, and those 5 words carried more weight than anything else that night. I felt something shift again, deeper this time, not about Lillian, not about the wedding, but about the direction this was all moving in, because this was no longer about a single lie, it was about a pattern, a history, something that connected this moment to something else I had not yet seen. "To who?" I asked, already knowing the answer would not be simple. Emily hesitated then, just slightly, the first real sign of something human breaking through her composure, and when she turned to look at me, her eyes held something different now, not just certainty, but something closer to memory. "To my mom," she said, and in that instant, the night stopped being about what I had avoided and became about what I had never meant to overlook. The words did not echo, but they stayed, settling into the space between us with a weight that no sound could carry away, and for a moment I did not respond because I was searching through something I had not needed to revisit in years, not names, not faces, but decisions, the kind that seem small at the time and only reveal their reach long after they have been made. "Your mother," I repeated quietly, not as a question, but as a confirmation that I had heard her correctly, and Emily nodded. Once, her eyes still steady on mine, but now there was something else there, something softer, something that did not belong to certainty but to memory. "She trusted someone she should not have," Emily said, her voice careful, as if each word had been chosen long before tonight, and when everything fell apart, no one helped her. The sentence was simple, almost too simple, but I understood what lived inside it, the kind of loss that does not need to be described in detail to be felt, and I felt something tighten in my chest, not guilt exactly, but recognition of a pattern I had seen before and chosen not to follow to its end. "And you think that someone was her?" I asked, referring to Lillian without saying her name, and Emily shook her head slightly. "I know it was," she said, and there was no hesitation this time, no doubt, just quiet certainty that made it impossible to dismiss. I looked past her for a moment, out toward the dark stretch of land beyond the glass, letting the silence return, not because I needed time to think, but because I needed to understand what this meant beyond the surface, because this was no longer about a disrupted wedding, this was about a chain of events that had reached me without my awareness, and that was something I did not allow to happen. Why come to me? I asked finally, bringing my attention back to her, because that was the question that mattered now, not what had happened, but why she had chosen this moment, this place, this risk. Emily hesitated again, longer this time, her small hand tightening slightly at her side, and for the first time, she looked like a child instead of a messenger. Because you are the only one she would listen to, she said, and that answer landed differently, not sharp, not sudden, but deep, because it carried an assumption about me that I had not considered, that I was not just capable of stopping something, but that I would choose to. I exhaled slowly, the realization settling into something heavier than I expected, because she was not just asking for help, she was placing responsibility, and responsibility was something I had always measured carefully. Where is your mother now? I asked, my voice lower, more focused, because whatever came next would not stay contained within this night. Emily looked down briefly, then back up, and the shift in her expression told me everything before she spoke. She does not go out much anymore, she said, she says it is easier that way. Easier. Another simple word that carried more than it showed, and I felt the direction of this night change again, moving away from what had been prevented and toward what had been left unresolved. Behind us, the faint sound of movement returned, the world beginning to reassemble itself into something presentable, but I knew that none of it mattered anymore, not the guests, not the ceremony, not the image that had been carefully constructed for tonight. What mattered was standing in front of me, small, steady, and far more significant than anyone else in that room had realized. I looked down at Emily once more, seeing her now not as an interruption, not as a warning, but as a connection to something I had not yet faced, and as the weight of that understanding settled into place, I realized that tonight had not been interrupted, it had been redirected, and I had just been given a choice that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with what I was willing to become next. The noise of the evening began to return in fragments, distant laughter from the terrace, the soft clink of glasses, the illusion of normal continuing just beyond the glass, but inside me, nothing had returned to normal, because the direction of this night had shifted too far to pretend otherwise. I looked down at Emily again, really looked this time, not just at her face but at the way she held herself, the quiet control, the absence of hesitation, and I realized that whatever she had been through, whatever her mother had endured, it had shaped her into someone who did not ask for help lightly. How did you find me? I asked, because that question mattered now more than anything else, not out of suspicion, but out of understanding the path that had led her here. She glanced toward the doors for a second, as if measuring how much time we had left before the world intruded again, then looked back at me. People talk, she said simply, they say you fix things. The words were not praise, they were not admiration, they were a statement of fact, the kind that carries expectation without emotion, and I felt the weight of that settle into place, heavier than I expected, because fixing things had always meant something different in my world, something controlled, calculated, distant, not this, not standing in front of a child who believed I could change something that had already been broken. And you believe that? I asked, my voice quieter now, less certain than before, because I was no longer asking as the man who controlled outcomes, but as someone trying to understand why she had chosen me at all. Emily did not answer immediately, and that pause told me more than a quick response ever could, because it meant she had thought about this, considered it, weighed it against whatever risk she believed she was taking. I believe you stopped tonight, she said finally, and her eyes did not leave mine when she spoke, so maybe you can stop what comes next. That landed differently, not as a request, but as a challenge, and I felt something shift again, something deeper, because she was not asking me to undo the past, she was asking me to prevent it from repeating, and that required something I had not needed in a long time, not power, not influence, but intention. I nodded slowly, not as a promise, not yet, but as acknowledgement that I understood what she was asking, and I turned slightly, signaling to the man standing a few steps behind us, the one who had been waiting without needing instruction. Prepare a car, I said quietly, we are leaving. There was no hesitation, no question, just a brief nod before he moved, because in my world, decisions like that were not explained, they were executed. Emily looked up at me then, a flicker of something crossing her face, not relief, not quite, but something close to it, something that suggested she had hoped for this outcome without allowing herself to expect it. "We are going to see her," I added, meeting her gaze fully now, and for the first time since she had spoken to me, her composure softened just slightly, just enough to remind me that beneath everything else, she was still a child carrying something too heavy for her age. I adjusted my jacket, the fabric settling back into place as if the night had not shifted at all, but I knew better, because this was no longer about an event or an image or a decision made in front of an audience. This was about something far more personal, something that had reached me without warning and refused to be ignored. As we moved toward the exit, away from the lights, away from the carefully constructed version of my life that had just been dismantled, I felt a clarity I had not expected to find tonight, not about who I was, but about what I had been avoiding, and as the doors opened and the night air met us, cool and quiet and honest, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was not walking away from something, I was walking toward it. The car door closed with a quiet finality that felt louder than anything that had happened inside, sealing off the noise, the lights, the version of my life that had almost continued without interruption, and as the engine started, the estate faded behind us in the rearview mirror like something that no longer belonged to me. Emily sat beside me, small against the leather seat, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed forward as if she had already traveled this road in her mind long before tonight, and I found myself watching her not out of curiosity anymore, but out of respect, because it takes a certain kind of strength to walk into a world like mine and change its direction without hesitation. The city lights stretched ahead in long lines of gold and white, the kind of view I had seen 1,000 times without really seeing it, but tonight felt different, sharper, as if every detail mattered in a way it had not before. "How far?" I asked, my voice quieter now, not carrying command, just intent. 20 minutes, she said, her tone steady, as if she had measured it precisely, and I nodded once, settling back as the car moved through the night, each mile closing the distance between what had been avoided and what was waiting. I did not ask more questions right away because I understood that some answers do not come faster when you demand them, and besides, I already knew enough to recognize that this was not just about her mother, it was about a pattern that had been allowed to exist unchecked, a blind spot I had never considered because it had never affected me directly, until now. The silence between us was not uncomfortable, it was focused, the kind that carries purpose rather than avoidance, and after a few minutes, Emily spoke again, her voice softer, less certain than before. "She is going to be scared," she said, not looking at me, "she does not trust people like you." The statement was honest, unfiltered, and I found myself almost appreciating it, because trust was not something I had ever expected to be given freely. "She has a reason not to," I replied, equally direct, because there was no value in pretending otherwise, and for a moment, Emily glanced at me, as if weighing that answer against something she already believed. "Then why are you coming?" she asked, and that question stayed in the air longer than the others, because it was not about logistics, it was about intention, about motive, about something I had not fully put into words yet. I looked out at the road ahead, the steady rhythm of streetlights passing by, and I realized that the answer was simpler than I had expected, but heavier than I had anticipated. "Because I should have looked sooner," I said, my voice low, almost to myself, but she heard it, I knew she did, because she did not ask again. The car turned onto a quieter street, the city noise fading into something softer, more residential, more real, and I felt something shift inside me again, not the sharp clarity of earlier, but something steadier, something that felt closer to responsibility than control. When the car finally slowed, pulling up in front of a modest building with dim hallway lights and worn steps, Emily straightened slightly, her composure returning in that quiet, determined way I had come to recognize, and I understood that whatever came next mattered more than anything that had happened before. I stepped out first, the cool air grounding me, and as I walked around to her side. Opening the door, she looked up at me for a brief second, her eyes searching, not for reassurance, but for consistency, for proof that I was still the same person who had chosen to listen. "You do not have to say anything perfect," she said quietly, "just do not lie." I held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once, because in a world built on control and calculation, honesty was the one thing I had never needed to practice, and as we walked toward the door together, I realized that tonight was never about stopping a mistake, it was about being given a chance to become something I had never planned to be, and for once, I did not intend to walk away from it.